A nation that seeks to expand its borders in the name of spreading its own greatness. A nation that wages war on a people who don't even have a formal military. A nation that commits genocide against an indigenous population. A nation that occupies territories inhabited by a sovereign people. A nation that displaces said people and then forces them onto small patches of land where their water supplies are intentionally polluted with agricultural waste and industrial runoff. A nation that is built on slave labor. A nation that stages coups to overthrow duly elected officials and replaces them with tyrants who are sympathetic to the nation's extractive endeavors. A nation that criminalizes the practicing of one's culture, ensuring that those languages and rituals die with the last generation of tradition bearers. A nation that deputizes a secret police that has the right to capture, interrogate, and imprison political dissidents. A nation that requires children in the metropole to pledge allegiance to the state before they can be spoon-fed inaccurate retellings of history that frame the victor through a lens that's less damning. A nation that turns children into orphans and then labels them terrorists when they grow up and join resistance groups in the name of avenging their fallen parents. A nation that intentionally murders any leader that poses a threat to its existence. Am I talking about the Fire Nation or the United States of America? Before I answer that question, I need to set the scene for what inspired this video, which was the 12-Day War. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched airstrikes on more than 100 Iranian military and nuclear sites, along with residential neighborhoods, killing key nuclear scientists and military commanders. Iran then retaliated by launching hundreds of ballistic missiles against Israeli cities. On June 22nd, the United States struck Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, all nuclear facilities in Iran, causing Iran to launch missiles at the United States' biggest air base in the Middle East. 2 days later, the United States was able to broker a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, but unfortunately not soon enough because hundreds of people were killed, thousands were injured, and infrastructure was destroyed. Although most of the world seemed to be concerned that the 12-Day War could escalate into something with global implications, some American politicians and pundits didn't seem to share those concerns. In fact, some even seemed to be in favor of the U.S. becoming militarily involved in a fight that was started by Israel, all in the name of ensuring that Iran would never have a nuclear bomb, something that Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been crying wolf about for the past 30 years. They say that history repeats itself. They also say that trends come back every 20 years. And given the fact that all of this was happening a little over 20 years ago after the Iraq War began, I wasn't surprised that America would consider going to war with Iran. What I was surprised by was the messaging that pundits in the media and politicians in the government used to justify war with Iran to the American public. The reason why I was surprised was because the messaging used to justify war with Iran was practically the same as the messaging that was used to justify war with Iraq in 2003. There was no vamping, no improvising. It was like a word for word, bar for bar recitation of the company line. And it made me think they're doing it again. They're trying to manufacture consent for another war in the Middle East. Manufacturing consent is the idea that people don't come to political conclusions on their own. Rather, our support for systems and policies is shaped by the propaganda pushed by politicians in the media. The term manufacturing consent was coined by Walter Lippmann in 1922 as a response to him observing the way that propaganda influenced public opinion during World War I. The term was then popularized by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media. The book outlines how biases in the media manufacture consent for wars and genocides through 5 key filters, which are ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, and fear. I'm about to spoil the plot of Avatar: The Last Airbender, so if you haven't seen the animated TV show, or you haven't read the comics, then go do that and then come back to this video. So Avatar: The Last Airbender premiered in 2005 on Nickelodeon, and it's set in a pre-industrial East Asian inspired world that's divided between 4 nations, each coinciding with a different element. So you have water, earth, fire, and air in that order. And some of the individuals in this world have the ability to telekinetically manipulate at most one element, with the avatar possessing the sole ability to manipulate all 4. Because of the avatar's supernatural capabilities and status as a revered religious icon, only the avatar can enforce balance between the 4 nations, and historically the avatar was able to do that until Fire Lord Sozin murdered Avatar Roku for trying to prevent the unification of the 4 nations through imperialism. Well, actually, he doesn't murder Avatar Roku. Murder's a strong word. I'll say he leaves him for dead. And he allows him to die from smoke inhalation. 12 years after the death of Avatar Roku, Fire Lord Sozin harnesses the power of a comet to enhance the bending abilities of the Fire Nation's army, and he launches an attack on the other 3 nations, resulting in the genocide of the air nomads. Well, every air nomad except for Aang, who's the 12-year-old protagonist of the show. And for those of you who haven't seen the show, Aang's age and nationality are very important, because remember how Avatar Roku died 12 years ago? Well, Aang is the reincarnated version of Avatar Roku. And the reason why Fire Lord Sozin is hell-bent on exterminating all of the air nomads is because the Avatar spirit cycles through the elements in the order of water, earth, fire, and air. So when an avatar dies, they're reborn into the next element. So Avatar Roku was a firebender, meaning his reincarnate would be an airbender. So that's why Fire Lord Sozin exterminates the air nomads, to murder the one person who stood a chance at stopping him. And Fire Lord Sozin ironically kills everyone except the one person he intended to kill, which is Aang. So Aang becomes the sole survivor of the genocide of air nomads. And the reason why this happens is because the monks inform him that he is the avatar 4 years before they're supposed to tell him, because they sense an impending war and they need him to undergo training that will prepare him for combat. But his relationship with his mentor, Monk Gyatso, poses a threat to his study, so the monks conspire to separate Aang and Gyatso. Aang overhears this plan, he runs away, he gets caught in a storm, and slips into the avatar state. He encases himself into an iceberg. So in the pilot episode, pilot basically just means the first episode of the series. In the pilot episode, Aang is accidentally freed from this iceberg by a young waterbender named Katara, and he quickly learns that he's just been awakened from a century-long coma, meaning the world he remembers is long gone. He learns that there's an ongoing 100-year war that resulted in the Fire Nation's consistent ratings of the Water Tribe, the Fire Nation's conquering of parts of the Earth Kingdom, and the Fire Nation's genocide of the air nomads. It enrages and then saddens Aang to know that practically everyone he's ever loved is dead, but it also saddens him to know that they've been slaughtered because he shirked his responsibilities as the Avatar, giving him an overwhelming sense of guilt. So he spends the next 3 seasons of the show embarking on a journey to master all 4 elements, to defeat the Fire Lord and restore balance to the 4 nations. And while Aang embarks on this journey, we learn more about how the Fire Nation came to be the imperial power it is, and the way it was able to essentially manufacture consent for the genocide of the air nomads, the frequent raidings of the Water Tribe, and the conquering of the Earth Kingdom by using language to dehumanize the air nomads, by rewriting history to downplay the genocide of the air nomads, by framing the Avatar and freedom fighters as common enemies for inhabitants of the Fire Nation, and by using the threat of prisons and re-education camps to silence dissent. So one of the main examples we have in this actually comes from the comics. It's in 2020's Katara and the Pirate Silver, written by Faith Aaron Hicks. Team Avatar is flying around the Earth Kingdom when they get ambushed by the Fire Nation's army, who starts hurling flaming boulders at them, causing Katara to fall off of Appa, and she gets separated from the rest of the group. Aang, Sokka, and Toph stage an emergency landing, and they start searching for Katara. They stumble upon a Fire Nation soldier who attempts to capture Aang in hopes of delivering him to Fire Lord Ozai. But Toph subdues him, and the three then head off to rescue Katara. But before they can leave, the soldier yells, "You may escape today, but tomorrow the Fire Nation will find you. We'll never stop until the world is safe from your malice." And Aang is shocked by this. He asks what he did to be considered a malicious person, and the soldier responds that the air nomads were planning to take over the world, and that's why the Fire Nation had to stop them. Aang, who's desperate to clear his name and also the name of his people, leans into respectability politics and tries to use airbending to help the soldier, but the soldier tells him to get away from him and then calls him a demon. He then insists that the air nomads were using their bending to suffocate people, and that they had an army of winged people ready to target dissidents. Aang explains to the man that the air nomads were pacifists and are incapable of flying on their own. Rather, they can ride the wind with their gliders, but the man doesn't budge. So Aang asks him where he got his information, and the man tells him that a friend of a friend read it on a poster that the Fire Nation officials hung up. What makes this interaction so interesting is it gives a bit of context for what citizens of the Fire Nation are made to believe about the genocide of the air nomads. But it also exemplifies 2 of the 10 stages of genocide outlined by George H. Stanton, the 2 stages being dehumanization and polarization. The soldier dehumanizes Aang by calling him a demon and insisting that airbenders were winged like animals. He also brings up the propaganda that's put up in the Fire Nation to spread hate about the airbenders. In the animated show in Book 3, Episode 2, titled The Headband, Aang attends a school in the Fire Nation, and he gets to see firsthand how the Fire Nation indoctrinates its children. First, the children are forced to pledge allegiance to the Fire Lord, which, side note, is reminiscent of how in 2002, after 9/11, states like Minnesota passed laws requiring students to say the Pledge of Allegiance in American schools, but we'll return back to that a little bit later. So after reciting the pledge, the teacher administers a pop quiz where she specifically asks, "What year did Fire Lord Sozin battle the Air Nation army?" To which Aang replies, "Is that a trick question? The Air Nomads didn't have a formal military. Sozin defeated them by ambush." Not only does this propaganda exist within Fire Nation school systems, but it also exists within the entertainment industry within the Fire Nation. The best example of this is one of my favorite episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is Book 3, Episode 17, titled The Ember Island Players. In this episode, Team Avatar goes to see a play that's about them, and it's a play that takes a lot of creative liberties. It's parodic in nature. It's really funny, but when you look past how funny this episode is, it actually becomes kind of troubling that this is a form of entertainment for the citizens of the Fire Nation, that they feel the need to trivialize the pain of this group that's mainly composed of orphans. It's troubling that they think that there's something funny about Katara and her rallying cries about hope that she uses to uplift people who've been put down for so long. It's troubling that they think there's something funny about Sokka and his use of humor as a coping mechanism to deal with his harsh reality. It's troubling to think that there's something funny about the death of Jet. And it's reminiscent of the TikToks that so many Israelis did in the days after October 7th, mocking Palestinians in very racist, flat-out, minstrel ways, where they would draw on unibrows and black out some of their teeth and create makeshift hijabs. And they would impersonate these Palestinians, mocking their accents, mocking them for being starved by the Israeli government, mocking them for not having access to running water because Israel turned off their water, mocking them for being bombed and killed. I also think it's interesting that they feminize Aang in a way that's meant to decrease the threat he poses to the Fire Nation as an imperialist entity. For me, that's most reminiscent of a 2023 sketch done by What a Wonderful Country, which I guess is like the Israeli version of Saturday Night Live. And then they mock American students who created encampments on the campus of Columbia University in particular in protest of the school's investing into businesses that benefited from Israeli apartheid, among other things. But more on Israeli propaganda later. You can't have a conversation about propaganda in Avatar: The Last Airbender without mentioning Judy. Judy is one of Ba Sing Se's cultural ambassadors. We meet Judy in Book 2 when Aang and the gang visit Ba Sing Se, the capital of the Earth Kingdom, and her job is essentially to give them a tour, show them around, expose them to the culture of Ba Sing Se. But Team Avatar isn't really there for a tour. They're there to talk to the Earth King about the war with the Fire Nation, but Judy essentially stalls them. She goes out of her way to ensure that they don't have an audience of the Earth King. So one day, Judy gets in trouble with Long Feng because Team Avatar essentially sneaks their way into the palace to meet with the Earth King. And Long Feng is the Grand Secretariat of the Earth King, and the leader of the Dai Li, which is like the secret police. So Long Feng replaces Judy with another woman named Judy. So when Judy gets in trouble with Long Feng, he replaces her with another woman who's coincidentally also named Judy. And eventually the original Judy returns, and when she's asked where she was, the original one says that she took a vacation to Lake Laogai, which is essentially a re-education camp where dissenters are brainwashed by Long Feng and the Dai Li. Long Feng has essentially turned the Earth King into a figurehead who's completely oblivious to the fact that there is a war outside of the walls, which is why Long Feng had Judy going to such great lengths to ensure that the Avatar would not be able to speak to the Earth King. After the Earth King learns of this, he has Long Feng imprisoned. Long Feng then cuts a deal with Azula, the princess of the Fire Nation, and the Dai Li helps her stage a coup, overthrowing the Earth King and capturing the most powerful city in the Earth Kingdom, which is Ba Sing Se. So what's really strange in this episode is Team Avatar learns that the Dai Li has an entire army of like Stepford Wife-esque cultural ambassadors that they call Judy, and they brainwash them into promoting Dai Li propaganda. On a completely unrelated note, do you guys remember when Israel was kind enough to gift Oscar nominees $55,000 trips to Tel Aviv, with the only condition being that they publicize Israel as a luxury destination rather than a conflict zone? Do you also remember when Demi Lovato was reportedly paid $150,000 by the Ministry of Jerusalem Affairs to post content on behalf of Israel? You know, if we were to draw a Venn diagram of all of the American celebrities and influencers who've denied the existence of a genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, who've denied the existence of apartheid, ethnocracy, and tiered citizenship in Israel, and all of the celebrities who've denied the existence of illegal settlements in the West Bank, I'm sure that Venn diagram would look more like a circle. I should probably say that throughout this episode, I'm going to be jumping back and forth between real world examples and fictional examples. So back to Avatar. One of the things I think Avatar does really well is it shows us the perspectives of freedom fighters like Hakoda and Suki and Haru and Jet, who most, if not all, at some point experience some kind of flack, as Noam Chomsky would call it, or imprisonment for speaking out against the Fire Nation. And if you haven't seen the show, you should definitely watch it to learn more about those characters. But I think none of the stories are as chilling as the story of Hama. Hama, spelled Hama, keep that in mind because there are real world parallels. She was a water-bending master from the Southern Water Tribe, the same tribe as Sokka and Katara. She actually was friends with their grandmother, and when she was a young adult, the Fire Nation periodically raided the Southern Water Tribe, and she was one of the soldiers on the front line who defended the Water Tribe. Over time, the amount of soldiers dwindled as more people were captured, and eventually Hama was the last person standing, and she had no other choice but to surrender to the Fire Nation's army. She was taken to the Fire Nation, where she was held as a prisoner of war. During this time, the Fire Nation kept her and other benders in cages away from one another and would chain their limbs anytime they were given water to ensure they wouldn't be able to bend it. Hama was held captive for decades before she was finally able to escape after inventing a new style of bending that consisted of her manipulating the water in a person's body. And just for a second, I'd like for us to consider just how dire the conditions must have been for Hama, a female prisoner of war, that she had to both pioneer and master a new style of bending just to liberate herself. So after escaping from the prison, Hama moves to a small town in the Fire Nation and starts running an inn. Desperate for revenge, she uses her bloodbending to kidnap and disappear Fire Nation villagers every full moon. And once again, her name is Hama, spelled Hama, so do with that what you will. Now, do I think Hama should have done that? In an ideal world, no. The people she harmed weren't the ones who harmed her. Maybe they indirectly helped uphold a system that weakened the water tribe, depleted it of its resources, and led to the annihilation of every waterbender in the southern water tribe except her and Katara. But they didn't directly harm her. So I don't think her actions were totally justified. But I'm also sympathetic to her plight, because this is a woman who watched her people get slaughtered. She was tortured and spent decades in solitary confinement. So there's no telling what that did to her mind. And when you take all of those things into consideration, Hama is merely a product of the brutality that the Fire Nation subjected her to for decades. If you take issue with her methods, you should probably ask yourself, who did she learn them from in the first place? Hama is a mirror, and if the Fire Nation doesn't like what it sees, well then whose fault is that? Had the Fire Nation never attacked the Water Tribe and kidnapped Hama, she wouldn't have been in the Fire Nation to begin with, and she would have had no reason to want revenge. But once again, I'm just talking about a fictional character in a children's show. So by the end of book 3, Aang masters all 4 elements. He defeats the Fire Lord and restores balance to the world. And most of the fans of Avatar, The Last Airbender, would likely attribute the Resistance's victory against the Fire Nation to Aang for taking away Fire Lord Ozai's bending, or to Katara for subduing Azula, or even to Suki, Sokka, and Toph for taking down the fleet of Fire Nation airships. But I think the victory should be attributed to something else that most people overlook. But before I say what that is, I want to talk about the real world equivalent of the Fire Nation, at least in the 21st century. And that would be the United States of America. Like the Fire Nation, the United States government and media have been very effective at manufacturing consent for wars and genocides. There have been many instances in which that has happened, but one stands out in particular, and that is the Iraq War. But in order to understand the Iraq War, we have to set the stage with 9/11. So some of you are probably old enough to remember 9/11. Some of you are probably old enough to remember exactly where you were on 9/11. But for those of you who aren't, 9/11 is the common appellation given to a series of terrorist attacks perpetrated on September 11th, 2001, which consisted of 19 militants associated with the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacking 4 commercial airplanes, flying the first 2 into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City at 8:46 a.m. and 9:03 a.m. respectively, flying the third plane into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia at 9:37 a.m., and then crashing the 4th and final plane into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m. Unfortunately, 2,753 people died. In New York City, 184 died at the Pentagon and 40 died in Pennsylvania, resulting in the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history. This prompted then President George Bush, who had learned of the attack whilst visiting an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, to go back to D.C., where he would then deliver a speech addressing the nation almost 12 hours after the first plane had crashed into the tower. Now, besides the typical thoughts and prayers followed by a God bless America banter we usually get from the president after a crisis, there are three moments in the speech that are really important. The first one being the assertion that Al Qaeda's rationale for 9/11 should be attributed to a general hatred for American democracy and freedom, rather than their stated desire for retribution against America's support for Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories, retribution against America's sanctions on Iraq, and retribution against America's bombing of Afghanistan. The second moment that stands out is the promise to expand the scope of domestic surveillance and strengthen national security measures for the purpose of identifying the perpetrators of 9/11 and preventing the occurrence of a second 9/11. It's through this that we see the establishment of the Transportation Security Administration, better known as the TSA, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, including the creation of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, and the passing of the Patriot Act, which infringed on the civil liberties and privacy rights of the American people. The third moment being the declaration of a war on terror, announcing the future of American foreign policy and the basis, or rather the pretense, it would be built on. This speech, which was delivered in 5 minutes, was incredibly well received, driving Bush's approval rating from 55% favorable to 90% favorable, which is crazy because the average presidential approval rating since World War II has roughly been around 55% favorable. And even though Bush's approval rating before 9/11 was around 55% favorable, Bush wasn't that favorable of a president. I mean, he wasn't even that favorable of a candidate, lest we forget when Bush ran for president in the year 2000, he actually lost the popular vote to Al Gore and only became president because a 5-4 conservative majority in the Supreme Court decided to end the manual recount of faulty hanging Chad ballots in Florida, which caused Democrat nominee Al Gore to drop out of the race and Bush to gain all 25 of Florida's electoral votes, making him the 43rd president of the United States. Now, if it sounds like I'm saying George Bush had a motive to orchestrate 9/11, I'm not. I repeat, I'm not. But what I am saying is that 9/11 gave an unpopular president a 35% boost in popularity, which could be attributed to the rally round the flag effect, a term coined by John Muller. It describes the phenomenon when a nation unites behind its leader during a time of crisis, and America was in a time of crisis. According to a survey of U.S. adults conducted by Pew Research, in the days after 9/11, 71% of Americans felt depressed, 49% had difficulty concentrating, 33% had trouble sleeping, and more importantly, 87% felt angry about the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And it's this anger that leads to a strong desire for retribution, not for the sake of deterring crime, but for the sake of punishing those responsible for it. And when those responsible remain unpunished, people become more punitive towards those who had nothing to do with it. Enter Iraq. Because if you've been following along, 9/11 was perpetrated by Al Qaeda, which was formed in Pakistan under the rulership of Osama bin Laden, who was born in Saudi Arabia. But somehow Iraq becomes the scapegoat in all of this. So in October of 2002, 66% of Americans believed the falsehood that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein aided in the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States. And while that's not something George Bush explicitly said to the American people, this sentiment could and should be attributed to him because it's his constant referencing of 9/11 when speaking of the threat that Iraq poses to America that not only makes people think that there could be a second 9/11, but that Iraq was responsible for the first, creating a desire for both deterrence and punishment, with a whopping 66% of Americans favoring military action in Iraq to bring an end to Saddam Hussein's rule. Now, just because Bush didn't explicitly lie about the perpetrator of 9/11 doesn't mean he didn't explicitly lie about other things. According to the Center for Public Integrity, in the 2 years following 9/11, President Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and other top officials made at least 935 false statements about the national security threat posed by Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Among these were claims that Iraq sought high-strength aluminum tubes that were suitable for nuclear weapons production, claims that Iraq sought to purchase yellow cake uranium from Niger, a key component in nuclear bombs, claims of mobile biological weapons labs, and 532 occasions of them claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I think it's worth adding that Iraq stopped its nuclear weapons program way back in 1991 after it was ordered by the United Nations Security Council to do so. And America most likely knew this because the International Atomic Energy Agency and the United Nations Special Commission, two organizations that America played a leading role in, were tasked with overseeing the elimination of Iraq's chemical and biological ballistic missile programs. So the Bush administration intentionally misrepresented data, used fake intel, and oftentimes flat out lied to the American people to get them to support this war with very little to no pushback from the media. According to a study by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, pro-war media sources outnumbered anti-war sources by more than 6-1. And if you filtered out guests who weren't American, the American sources were 25 times more likely to support the war. And the journalists who didn't blindly support the war were often given flack, as Noam Chomsky would say. Among these were Phil Donahue, who was taken off the air at MSNBC in 2003 for opposing America's impending invasion of Iraq. Pulitzer Prize winning Peter Arnett was fired from NBC for granting an interview to state-controlled Iraqi television, and Jonathan Landay and Warren Strobel found it difficult to get their work published by outlets who were reluctant to post articles that contradicted the narrative pushed by the Bush administration. It is well recognized and may even be said to constitute a part of an institutional critique such as we present in this volume, that the various parts of media organizations have some limited autonomy, that individual and professional values influence media work, that policy is imperfectly enforced, and that media policy itself may allow some measure of dissent and reporting that calls into question the accepted viewpoint. These considerations all work to assure some dissent and coverage of inconvenient facts. The beauty of the system, however, is that such dissent and inconvenient information are kept within bounds and at the margins, so that while their presence shows that the system is not monolithic, they are not large enough to interfere unduly with the domination of the official agency, writes Chomsky and Herman in their book Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media. Not only do we see flack given to journalists who were brave enough to express their skepticism surrounding the war in Iraq, but we also see the flogging of celebrities who publicly proclaimed their anti-war positions. Among these were talk show host and Golly from Harriet the Spy, Rosie O'Donnell, who received backlash for famously, and rightly if you asked me, equating U.S. soldiers in Iraq to terrorists. Director Michael Moore, who was booed off stage after using his acceptance speech at the 2003 Academy Awards to call out our shoe-dodging former president. Backlash for actors Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins, who threw up two fingers as a universal sign for peace. Backlash for actor Andy Serkis, who had a placard that read "No War for Oil." And even backlash for Will Smith, who passed up a night of bitch-slapping fellow actors in active opposition to the war in Iraq. But nobody got as much heat from the right as the Dixie Chicks, a country music girl group from Dallas, Texas, consisting of two sisters, Marty McGuire and Emily Strayer, along with lead vocalist Natalie Maines. Now, I'm black, so I can't name any of the songs of the Dixie Chicks, but from my understanding, they were kind of like Destiny's Child for people who eat at Cracker Barrel, having sold more than 23 million records since their debut in 1998. But all of that came tumbling down when lead vocalist Natalie Maines decided to call Bush out on stage. 2 days after this, Natalie Maines publicly apologized to George Bush, but no amount of backtracking could save them. Country music stations stopped playing their music on the radio. Former fans disposed of the Dixie Chicks' CDs, tapes, and concert tickets, and fellow country music artists like Toby Keith likened the Chicks to Saddam Hussein. The Dixie Chicks never fully recovered from becoming the first victims of what would soon be cancel culture, and what I like to call it the shut up and dot dot dot. The shut up and dot 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 is a retort commonly employed by the conservative right to silence dissent. And the dot 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 is interchangeable with practically any verb that's associated with entertainment. So when Colin Kaepernick took a knee in protest of police brutality against black people in America, they told him to shut up and play football. When LeBron James spoke out against Donald Trump in 2018, they told him to shut up and dribble. And when the Dixie Chicks spoke out against the Iraq War in 2003, they told them to shut up and sing rather than speak out. The next part is really important because it connects to our next case study. So on May 1st, 2003, after overthrowing Saddam Hussein's government and capturing Baghdad, George Bush, whilst standing in front of a sign that read "Mission Accomplished," declared the end of major combat operations in Iraq only 6 weeks after the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq began. So if the President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, says the war is over, that means everyone gets to go home, right? Well, wrong. And a lot of that has to do with the insurgency in Iraq. So in May of 2003, the Coalition Provisional Authority issued Order Number 2, which disbanded the Iraqi military services associated with Saddam Hussein's regime, causing roughly 400,000 Iraqi soldiers to become unemployed. Because you have all of these soldiers by trade who are now out of work, it made it easy for them to be swept up by insurgency groups, the most popular being ISIS. So essentially, what was supposed to be a 6-week invasion became an even deadlier sectarian conflict that lasted for nearly a decade. And how does the U.S. justify this? Well, by positioning Saddam Hussein as a modern-day Hitler, with former CIA Director James Woosley saying Saddam Hussein poses the same kind of threat to the United States that Hitler posed in Germany in the mid-1930s, when the British and the French kept postponing dealing with him, the same way that some people are advocating dealing with Saddam. And remember how earlier, when I was talking about 9/11, I said that anger leads to a strong desire for retribution, not for the sake of deterring crime, but for the sake of punishing those responsible for it. Well, politicians are particularly skilled at manufacturing consent for wars and genocides, and one of the ways they do this is by hearkening back to anger caused by past traumas. And because we live in Western civilization, which is unapologetically committed to the preservation of whiteness, the one atrocity that is not universally acknowledged but is closer than most atrocities to being universally acknowledged as a bad thing that should never happen again is the Holocaust. And these politicians exploit the very legitimate generational PTSD that Jewish, Romani, disabled, and queer people have as a result of to further their own imperial pursuits. And by positioning Saddam Hussein as a modern-day Hitler, a herald of a second Holocaust, these politicians in many ways are suggesting that the ends justify the means. So who cares if America spends nearly a decade in Iraq? Who cares if the war cost the American taxpayer $728 billion? Who cares if no weapons of mass destruction were ever found? Who cares if Iraq still hasn't recovered more than 20 years later? Who cares if 170,300 American troops were deployed in Iraq? Who cares if 32,292 U.S. service members were wounded and 4,492 died? And most importantly, who cares if close to 300,000 Iraqi civilians were killed by the U.S. military? The only thing we're supposed to care about is stopping Saddam Hussein, and that we did. So, mission accomplished. So, if you're anything like me, and that would be chronically online, there's one topic that I'm 90% sure has found itself washing up on your digital shore, and that's Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And yes, I said Israel's genocide. I'm not going to mince words when it comes to this subject, because I think language as a tool has been used by Zionists to intentionally downplay the severity of this issue. I think Zionists would have us believe that they only take issue with what people are saying, but I'd argue they take issue with the fact that people are saying anything at all. They take issue with the fact that people have the audacity not to suffer in silence, because most people at this point know, like Zora Neale Hurston said, if you're silent, they'll say you enjoyed it. So I think it's incumbent upon us to not be silent, especially on behalf of those who have been silenced. So the history of Israel and Palestine is very long enough to predate the birth of Christ. So I'm not going to relitigate everything that's ever happened in the region. Because this is a video about U.S. foreign policy as it pertains to the Middle East, I don't think it's pertinent to hyperfixate on anything that happened before the Mayflower landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. If you want an in-depth retelling of Judea and the Canaanites, might I suggest Google. Anyway, we're going to start in 1881, which is when the first Aliyah began. The first Aliyah was a 22-year period where approximately 25,000 to 35,000 Jewish refugees fled pogroms in Eastern Europe, primarily in Russia. These pogroms consisted of anti-Jewish riots that led to the destruction and looting of Jewish property, the rape and then murder of tens of thousands of Jewish people from 1918 to 1920. The 25,000 to 35,000 Jewish people that were able to escape sought refuge in Palestine, which was ruled by the Ottoman Empire from 1516 to 1917. So in 1882, the first wave of Jewish refugees began purchasing land in Palestine. It's in 1896 that Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, publishes a book called The Jewish State, in which he outlines the importance of creating a Jewish state in response to the anti-Semitism that Jewish people were facing. 21 years later, the Ottomans, who sided with the Central Powers in World War I, ended up losing Palestine, which was then given to the Allied powers consisting of Great Britain, France, and Russia. But in 1916, Britain and France secretly drew up the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which outlines their respective spheres of influence in the Middle East, with the French taking Syria and the British taking Jordan, Iraq, and Palestine, which I think establishes a pattern that, absent from these discussions that are being made about the future of the Middle East, are people who are actually Middle Eastern. Among these were namely the Palestinians, who'd been on that land for a millennium. So it's on November 2nd, 1917, through the Balfour Declaration, that the British government announces support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which completely contradicts the promises Henry McMahon made to Sharif Hussein of Mecca for Arab independence as a payout for Arab support against the Ottomans in World War I. So what this all means is Britain has now promised the same plot of land to two different groups. So from 1922 to 1935, the Jewish population in Palestine rose from 9% of the total population to 27% of the total population, which led to the displacement of tens of thousands of Palestinians from their land. And it's in 1922 that the League of Nations grants a mandate for Palestine to Great Britain, which paves the way for the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which was caused by economic hardships among Palestinian farmers and increased Jewish migration to Palestine and land purchases in Palestine, and British policies that showed favoritism to Zionists. During this time, 415 Jewish people were killed, approximately 5,000 Arabs were killed, 15,000 were wounded, were imprisoned, along with British authorities destroying at least 2,000 Palestinian homes, putting 9,000 Palestinians in concentration camps, and then deporting 200 Palestinian nationalist leaders, resulting in the killing, wounding, exiling, or imprisonment of at least 10% of the Palestinian male population. So the Arab Revolt starts in 1936 and ends in 1939. As a response to an increase in Jewish migration to Palestine, with 30,000 to 60,000 Jewish refugees immigrating to Palestine between 1933 to 1936. And the timeline is important because this is during the Third Reich of Nazi Germany, and Hitler is scapegoating Jewish people for the Great Depression, among other things. And it's in July of 1938 that delegates from 32 countries convene in Evian, France, to discuss the crisis of Jewish refugees who were fleeing Nazi persecution. And while those countries expressed sympathy for the refugees, the vast majority of them didn't want to welcome any, often saying they couldn't afford to support them financially. The only country that was willing to accept Jewish refugees was the Dominican Republic. So because none of these other countries wanted to accept Jewish refugees and the Nazis didn't want Jewish citizens, Hitler launched the final solution in 1939, which was a 6-year period in which 6 million Jewish people, unfortunately, were systematically murdered by the Nazis, along with Romani people, queer people, disabled people, and political dissidents. And once again, this video is supposed to be about American foreign policy in the Middle East, and while America wasn't really involved in this yet, I'm trying to establish a motive for why some well-intentioned or seemingly well-intentioned American politicians, pundits, and even some citizens are Zionists. So 2 years after the Holocaust ended, on November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed UN Resolution 181, which divided Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. And over the course of the next 2 years, at least 750,000 Palestinians were forcefully expelled from their land, with Israel taking 78% of historic Palestine, which was 22% more than the 56% of the land that was originally allocated for Jewish refugees under the United Nations partition plan, leaving Palestinians with only 22% of the land divided between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And this period is called the Nakba. There's a book about this called The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi that delves into this. In this time, around 530 villages were destroyed, 15,000 Palestinians were killed, and there were more than 70 massacres, which is not surprising because in 1937, Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, wrote to his son, "The Arabs will have to go, but one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war." And oftentimes in media, if we're lucky, this is framed as a both sides issue rather than being framed as a colonized versus the colonizer issue. Some people may take issue to Israel being referred to as a settler colonial state, but the founders of Zionism frequently and explicitly did so themselves. In his essay, The Iron Wall, founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, wrote, "My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent." He later writes, "The native populations, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonist, irrespective of whether they were civilized or savaged. Every native population, civilized or not, regards its land as its national home, of which it's the sole master, and it wants to retain that mastery always. It will refuse to admit not only new masters, but new partners or collaborators. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." So the Nakba kind of sounds like the pogroms in Eastern Europe, and that's because it kind of was like the pogroms in Eastern Europe. The conditions that led to 25,000 to 35,000 Jewish refugees having to flee Eastern Europe were essentially the same conditions that the Palestinians were living under during the Nakba. I'll also add that on the Jewish side, an estimated 6,000 people were killed, 4,000 of them being soldiers and the remaining 2,000 civilians. So Israel emerges from the Arab-Israeli War victorious, and it's on May 14, 1948, that Israel declares its independence, which is coincidentally the same day that the British mandate ended in Palestine, causing the Brits to withdraw their forces from Palestine. And more importantly, it's also the day that the United States of America gets involved, with U.S. President Harry Truman being the first world leader to officially recognized the state of Israel just 11 minutes after it declared its independence. So during the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union supported Arab nationalist movements, causing the U.S. and Israel to get closer. Then it's with the Six-Day War, which results in Israel capturing the Sinai Peninsula, Jerusalem, Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. We see the formation of a real alliance between Israel and the United States. It's in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War that the United States starts providing aid to Israel, and by aid I mean $2.2 billion. And from 1946 to 2023, America gave Israel a reported $263 billion in aid, which is a lot of money. So what is the popular sentiment in America surrounding Israel and Palestine? Well, according to a Gallup poll conducted in March of 1948, 28% of Americans sympathized more with Jews, 11% more with Arabs, 44% with neither, and 16% were unsure. By the way, I'm sure this poll didn't necessarily take into account the thoughts and opinions of Americans of color, but if we move past the presumed shortcomings of this poll, I do think it's interesting that the overwhelming majority of Americans don't have an opinion on the issue. But for those that do, they are more than 2 times more likely to support Jewish people in the British Mandate of Palestine. It isn't until the 1960s that we see an upswing in American support for Israel, which reaches 55%, but then declines by 11 points in response to 1967's Six-Day War between Israel and Palestine, with support for Palestine remaining minimal and those not interested in taking a side increasing by 7 percentage points. The average level of support for Israel was around 42%. In the 80s, it increased to 46%. In the 1990s, support reached an all-time high of 64% amidst the Gulf War. In fact, the House of Representatives approved President Obama's request to give Israel $205 million in funding for its Iron Dome anti-missile defense system. The vote count for this bill was 410 to 4. So if there are 435 members of the House of Representatives and 410 voted in favor of the Iron Dome, then that means that 94% of the representatives in the House supported giving military aid to Israel. The Senate then passed the bill by unanimous consent. So if public support for Israel has never been higher than 64%, then why do over 90% of American politicians consistently support Israel? Meet AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. It was created in 1954 and didn't gain prominence until the Yom Kippur War in 1973, which is when AIPAC started gaining enough influence to sway congressional opinion, when their budget grew from $300,000 to $7 million. And by 1982, AIPAC was able to use that influence to unseat pro-Palestinian Representative Paul Finley in favor of Dick Durbin. By the way, Paul Finley had served 11 terms before AIPAC got him out of there. He was pretty ahead of his time. He opposed the Vietnam War. He helped Frank Mitchell become a page in the House of Representatives in 1965, making Mitchell the first black page in the House of Representatives since the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. In 2002, he even published an article saying 9/11 wouldn't have happened had it not been for the U.S.'s uncritical support of Israel. So it's in the 80s that AIPAC establishes itself as a lobbying group to fear. And if you express empathy for the plight of Palestinians, AIPAC will fund the campaign of your opponent. A modern example of that is AIPAC spending more than $9 million to unseat Representative Cori Bush for voicing her support for Palestinians and referring to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a war criminal. The nearly $9 million went towards buying racist ads that depicted Cori Bush with darkened and exaggerated facial features. AIPAC also spent an unprecedented $17 million just to defeat Congressman Jamal Bowman in the Democratic primaries in New York. The lengths that AIPAC is willing to go to just to unseat a representative from a flyover state for merely criticizing Israel is the reason why the vast majority of politicians on both sides of the aisle are unwilling to do that. Also, AIPAC isn't registered with the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which requires individuals and entities acting as agents for foreign governments, political parties, or other foreign principals to register with the United States Department of Justice in order to ensure transparency with the American public and protect national security. It doesn't publicly disclose the names of politicians who've been recipients of AIPAC donations, which creates a conflict of interest because the American people don't know which of our politicians are financially beholden to a foreign lobby. While on the topic of Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, 2 black American politicians, Earlier, I said that I doubted that the Gallup poll from 1948 included Black Americans in its survey. And the reason why I said that was because there's a long history of solidarity between the Black diaspora and Palestinians. In 1964, Malcolm X was one of the first Black leaders to meet with the Palestinian Liberation Organization when he visited Gaza. The Black Panther Party aligned with the Palestinian struggle against Israeli settler colonialism and American imperialism. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the key organizations in the civil rights movement, declared solidarity with Palestinians after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit supported Palestine. Angela Davis, Cornel West, Alice Walker, and Toni Morrison have all publicly supported Palestine. More recently, Ta-Nehisi Coates, even Nelson Mandela, less than 2 weeks after being released from prison in 1990, stood in solidarity with Palestinians by embracing Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. And Palestinians have also been very supportive of Black liberation. During the Ferguson riots that were caused by the police killing of unarmed Black teenager Michael Brown, it was Palestinians in Gaza who took to social media to teach Black Americans who were protesting how to withstand the chemical compounds and tear gas, something Palestinians had a lot of experience with at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces. So, why does Black and Palestinian solidarity matter? Well, the civil rights movement is the cornerstone of social justice in the United States of America. The civil rights movement, organized by young Black Americans, set off a chain reaction of civil and sometimes not so civil disobedience in America, inspiring the farm workers' rights movement in the 1960s, the American Indian movement in 1968, the gay rights movement in 1970s, second wave feminism in the 1970s as well. Because of the legacy and impact of the civil rights movement, young Black Americans are usually the arbiters of political correctness and social justice. So if young Black Americans take issue with something and deem it problematic, it's only a matter of time before the rest of liberal society follows suit. Case in point, the Black Lives Matter movement was created in 2013 in response to George Zimmerman being acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And for years, the slogan Black Lives Matter was seen as a form of reverse racism by most non-Black people and even some Black people who preferred the dismissive all lives matter. It wasn't until the racial reckoning of 2020 that those people were willing to concede that Black lives did in fact matter, and that took 7 years to accomplish. The point that I'm making is that young Black Americans create ripples that turn into tidal waves. I think that's the reason why Israeli diplomat Judith Varney Schorer said the major problem with Israel is with the young Black generation of the Black community. That's the reason why you have a Black politician like Cory Booker on the record encouraging AIPAC to find young Black college students and essentially bribe them with free trips to Israel so they can become mouthpieces for the Zionist project. So as a consequence of the Six-Day War, Israel expelled 300,000 Palestinians from their homes and began their military occupation of Gaza. This occupation entailed the confiscation of land, illegal settlements, and institutionalized discrimination against Palestinians. Things got so bad that the United Nations called for a withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from the Gaza Strip way back in November of 1967, deeming it unlawful, a position they maintain to this day. But it isn't until 2005 that Israel finally withdraws troops from Gaza, almost 38 years after the United Nations ordered it to do so. And even when Israel withdrew troops from Gaza, 2 years later in 2007, they imposed a blockade, restricting the entry of goods like cement, glass, steel for the purpose of rebuilding infrastructure that was destroyed by bombs, restricting the entry of food and medical supplies, and then also preventing Gazans from participating in trade with other countries, which could have helped grow their economy. And while that's happening in Gaza, Israel's creating illegal settlements in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. For context, settlements are illegal under international law because they violate the Fourth Geneva Convention, which bans occupying forces from transferring their populations to the areas they occupy. But does that stop Israel from creating more settlements? No, of course not. Israel is above the law. So there are more than 700,000 settlers living in 150 settlements and 128 outposts. Palestinian farmers have to apply for permits to access their own land. These permits have to be renewed constantly. They can be denied or revoked without explanation. 3 million Palestinians live in the West Bank, and their movements are restricted by almost 700 road obstacles and 140 checkpoints. There are around 70,000 Palestinians who have Israeli permits, and they have to cross these checkpoints on a daily basis. This sounds like apartheid in South Africa. It sounds like Jim Crow in the American South, and once again, it sounds like the pogroms in Eastern Europe. There's also a conversation to be had about settler violence, which mainly consists of armed settlers who go to Palestinian villages and set their crops on fire, vandalize their homes, and assault and sometimes even murder Palestinians in the West Bank. And these settlers are never held accountable, especially considering that Israeli soldiers are the ones backing them up as they commit these violent acts. So, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas breaches the border and takes Israeli civilians and soldiers hostage. Approximately 1,200 people are killed. This kicks things into overdrive. By October 9th, Israel's defense minister ordered a complete siege of Gaza, cutting off supplies of food, electricity, and fuel to the Gaza Strip, which had a population of 2.3 million people. This is what the United Nations calls collective punishment. It's also illegal under international law. So October 7th begins the bombardment of Gaza, and Western civilization uses its tried and true tactics to manufacture consent for what will obviously turn into a genocide. Language is used to dehumanize Palestinians, who are frequently referred to as children of darkness and children of the jungle. Elena Dudam, a Palestinian Syrian American writer, has an article with Time magazine where she talks about the use of passive voice and bias in the media coverage of Israel and Palestine. They retaliated, I interjected, angry again, at the empty spaces left in the professor's response, as if Zionism and its goal had no role in why there were Palestinian uprisings. In a 2002 report completed by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, researchers found that during the Second Intifada, the word retaliation was used 79% of the time to describe Israeli violence against Palestinians in American news outlets. Meanwhile, Palestinian violence was characterized as retaliation only 9% of the time. Palestinians attacked or threw rocks, or at best, there were Palestinian uprisings that seemed to spring from the ground without any explanation of the pressure that premeditated why the surface cracked in the first place. Since its bombardment of Gaza, Israel has committed gross violations of human rights, including intentionally killing at least 227 journalists, damaging and destroying 33 out of the 36 hospitals in Gaza, destroying 70% of Gaza's infrastructure, injuring over 118,000 people, killing more than 60,000 Palestinians with an average of 28 Palestinian children being killed each day. To put that into perspective, 28 kids is the size of a classroom. According to the Red Cross, 470,000 people in Gaza face starvation, which is almost a fourth of the population. And since Israel won't allow in aid trucks, other countries are having to parachute aid into Gaza, which is incredibly dangerous. Some people are literally being crushed to death. It's all very dystopian. Some say that Gaza has or is close to reaching level 5 starvation, which puts the Palestinians at risk for refeeding syndrome, which is when feeding is reintroduced after a period of starvation or malnutrition. It can lead to complications with vital organs. It can also lead to death. Ironically, it was first recorded following the liberation of concentration camps at the end of World War II, when Holocaust survivors who'd been starved by the Nazis died after being reintroduced to food. All of these things are gross violations of human rights, and that's worth noting because the Leahy Law, named after Senator Patrick Leahy, prohibits or is supposed to prohibit the United States from giving military aid to foreign security force units that have committed gross violations of human rights, and yet we have bipartisan support for giving military aid to Israel. A recent resolution proposing to block U.S. arms sales to Israel failed in the Senate by a vote of 27 to 70. For context, according to data from Progress ZTO poll from April of 2025, 71% of Democratic primary voters said the United States should end its arms transfers to Israel. I think one of the things that's particularly frustrating about the discourse surrounding Palestine is for U.S. politicians who tend to speak out on behalf of Israel, there's always a conversation surrounding the return of Israeli hostages, which I do think is necessary. But there's never any mention of the almost 10,000 Palestinians who are essentially being held hostage in Israeli detention centers. 9,900 of them are political prisoners. 3,498 are administrative detainees who are being held without charge or trial. 400 of them are children. 27 of them are women. According to the Defense for Children Palestine, between 500 to 700 Palestinian children are detained and prosecuted by the Israeli military court system every year, and this was happening before October 7th. Before October 7th, there were 5,250 Palestinians being held as political prisoners, and since October 7th, that number has practically doubled. I think when all is said and done, in order to salvage what's left of Israel's reputation, the establishment within the United States of America is going to position Benjamin Netanyahu as the fall guy. He's an easy scapegoat. He's incredibly unpopular in Israel. He's been on trial for corruption in Israel since 2020, and the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest way back in November of 2024. And while Netanyahu certainly has a lot of blame to shoulder, the weight shouldn't fall squarely on him. I think Joe Biden needs to be held accountable for the role he played in this genocide. Donald Trump, Antony Blinken, Kamala Harris, all of the politicians who voted to censor Rashida Tlaib, all of the Congress members who continue to give military aid to Israel, the pundits in the media who've lied, those who've suppressed stories, the universities that have gone after students. Not only do we see passive voice being used by the media, they tend to frame the issue with headlines like Israelis killed by Hamas, whereas when they talk about Palestinians, they say Palestinians die or lives are lost, and there is disproportionate coverage. There's a statistical imbalance in media coverage with far more empathy for Israeli victims and less focus on the sheer scale for Palestinian suffering and displacement. More than that, I think that there is an over-reliance on official Israeli sources, similar to the Iraq War, how there was an over-reliance on American sources. The media relies on Israeli military and government spokespeople presenting their claims as fact without sufficient independent verification, which is largely due to the fact that Israel won't allow independent journalists into Gaza. And the journalists who have been in Gaza are quite literally being hunted down by the Israeli Defense Forces. What ends up happening is you have world leaders and pundits in the media who reiterate these accusations that have not been fact-checked. I mean, there was a really popular one that Joe Biden had to walk back in October of 2023. And I'm not going to say what it was, but it involved the number 40. So you can Google that. But skepticism is regularly applied to anything that comes out of Gaza. When Palestinians talk about the amount of Palestinians who've been murdered by Israel, the headlines tend to read, according to the Hamas-ran Gaza Health Ministry, as a way of dismissing very valid concerns about the amount of Palestinians who've been murdered by Israel. When we talk about FLAC and the suppression of dissent, I think three of the institutions that we should be looking at are AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, and ICE, which work in tandem to essentially deport people who are critical of Israel. I mean, look at the detention of Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia student who was detained for months for exercising his First Amendment right to freedom of speech. Journalists who try to provide context or critically report on Israel face accusations of anti-Semitism. A perfect example of this was Mark Lamont Hill losing his job at CNN way back in 2018 for calling for Palestinian liberation. Joy Reid speculated that her coverage of Gaza was one of the things that got her fired from MSNBC. 111 BBC journalists accused the BBC of censoring its coverage of Gaza. The resignation of Claudine Gay from Harvard. Even politicians who are critical of Israel are punished. Rashida Tlaib was censored for promoting false narratives regarding October 7th and calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. Congress passed a measure in 2023 that conflated criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism. We've also seen the public flogging of Zohran Mamdani by the establishment. This has also seeped its way into the entertainment industry. Melissa Barrera was fired from Scream for being vocal about the genocide of Palestinians. Rachel Zegler has received flack. Bella Hadid, Dua Lipa. Things have gotten so bad that the Zionists are even starting to go after Miss Rachel. They're going after Miss Rachel, right? And I think that there's a conversation to be had about the role that social media has played in all of this, because people don't trust the coverage that they're receiving from legacy media outlets. They've turned to independent journalists and opinion hosts on social media platforms like TikTok, which is one of the reasons why I think politicians are trying to ban TikTok. I think what differentiates this genocide from past genocides is the people experiencing it have not only been able to film it for posterity, but then distribute these videos to the rest of the world in a matter of seconds. And I think that's what makes social media particularly dangerous for politicians and the media who are trying to manufacture consent for this genocide. Is it becomes very difficult to control the narrative when that narrative can be countered in real time by people who are experiencing these things. I think that social media has been able to bridge the divide that exists between nations that are separated by geographical borders. And I think that's one of the reasons why politicians are going out of their way to try to ban apps like TikTok. I mean, can you imagine if TikTok had existed in the aftermath of 9/11? If TikTok had existed in the aftermath of 9/11, I don't know if as many Americans would have supported the invasion of Iraq. So what do I think is going to happen with Israel and Palestine? I'm not entirely sure. I do think that Israel is a state that has been dependent on its PR for a long time. I think that's the reason why it does outreach with American celebrities. I think that Israel was built on a premise of sympathy for the descendants of the Holocaust, and it becomes difficult to maintain a state like that if it is found guilty of committing a genocide, which is why I think so many Zionists in the media and in the American political system are reluctant to call this a genocide, because then it makes the whole operation untenable. I think Netanyahu is being positioned as the fall guy by Zionists who are trying to salvage what's left of Israel. I think he's an easy scapegoat. He is incredibly unpopular in Israel. He's on trial for corruption. He's actually been on trial for corruption in Israel since 2020. And the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest way back in November of 2024. And while Netanyahu certainly has a lot of blame to shoulder, the weight shouldn't fall squarely on him. I think Joe Biden needs to be held accountable for the role he played in this genocide. Donald Trump needs to be held accountable. Anthony Blinken, Kamala Harris, all of the politicians who voted to censor Rashida Tlaib, all of the members of Congress who've continued to give Israel military aid, the pundits in the media who've lied. I think everyone who's suppressed stories, the universities that have gone after students, the world leaders that have been complicit, everyone needs to be held accountable. I think if Hamas should be held accountable for October 7th, then the Israeli Defense Forces should also be held accountable for every day before October 7th and every day since. And I think it's worth noting that when the establishment tries to frame Netanyahu as an outlier within Israeli society, we don't forget that he actually wasn't. He may be unpopular, but his politics certainly are not. A recent Haaretz poll found that 82% of Israelis support the expelling of Palestinians from Gaza, which is by definition ethnic cleansing and also very illegal under international law. So when the media tries to frame Netanyahu as an outlier within Israeli society, don't fall for it. He may be unpopular, but his politics certainly are not. While we're on the topic of Benjamin Netanyahu, he tried to manufacture American consent for war with Iran. For the past 33 years, Netanyahu has said that Iran was practically minutes away from having a nuclear bomb, and that's not an exaggeration. He said it in 1992, he said it in 1995, he said it in 2002, he said it in 2009, he said it in 2012, he said it in 2025. He's used that excuse for Israel's unprovoked attack on Iran on June 13, 2025. And the media uses the same tactics. It always does. It tries to position Iran as a common enemy primarily through its nuclear program, even though intelligence assessments have contradicted claims of active weapons development. It tries to position Iran as a threat to Western civilization and gives critics flack and calls them anti-Semitic for not wanting to be dragged into a war that Israel started. But the general public didn't seem to fall for it. YouGov found that only 16% of Americans thought that the United States military should get involved in the conflict between Israel and Iran. What that shows is people don't trust legacy media outlets anymore. They're becoming increasingly skeptical. Another way that the media try to manufacture consent for a war with Iran was by weaponizing the misogyny and homophobia that sometimes exists within the Middle East, which is a common tactic that pundits in the media tend to use. The common argument we tend to hear from Zionists is that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and Hamas is homophobic. But that feels contradictory because gay marriage isn't even legal in Israel, nor is inter-ethnic marriage for that matter. And I'm not saying that the Middle East is the safest place in the world for women and queer folks. It most certainly is not. But the solution shouldn't be to bomb them. Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, making it illegal to get an abortion in 12 states. Gay marriage was only made legal a decade ago and can be overturned at any moment. And to top it all off, you now even have Democrat politicians like Pete Buttigieg and Gavin Newsom actively pandering to the right by throwing trans people under the bus. Would those same pundits argue that more progressive countries should have the right to bomb America because of our misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic policies? No, they wouldn't. So let's return to Avatar. Earlier, I said that the Resistance's victory against the Fire Nation should be attributed to something that most people overlook. And before I say what that thing is, I want to admit that the liberation of the three nations from Fire Nation occupation is the result of a collective effort from a group of pan-national freedom fighters led by a somewhat messianic figure. And this was an effort that was 100 years in the making, but a large part of the reason why this coalition was able to defeat Fire Lord Ozai was because of one particular group. And I'm going to call that group the Defectors. And what I mean by that are former members of the Fire Nation who defected and joined the resistance. This group includes Zhang Zhang, who was Aang's first firebending teacher, Pian Dao, who taught Sokka swordsmanship, and Uncle Iroh, who de-radicalized Zuko and helped him realize that his true destiny was helping the Avatar defeat his father. All three of whom belonging to the Order of the White Lotus, a transnational secret society that was responsible for liberating Ba Sing Se from Fire Nation occupation in the series finale. You also have Zuko, who joins Team Avatar and teaches Aang how to firebend and redirect lightning, two skills he needs to defeat the Fire Lord. You could even include Mai and Ty Lee, who inadvertently play a huge role in defeating the Fire Lord because it's their betrayal that ultimately sends Azula into psychosis and makes her easier to defeat. So with that in mind, if America is the real world parallel for the Fire Nation, at least in the 21st century it is, what can we as Americans do to ensure that we are not susceptible to falling prey to misinformation and more often than not disinformation that is propagated by the American media and American politicians? Because unfortunately, the media and politicians will always try to manufacture consent for wars and genocides. And unfortunately, we don't have any power over that. But what we do have power over is who we vote for, whose campaigns we choose to donate to, the causes we choose to spread awareness about, the voices we choose to amplify, the independent media outlets we choose to subscribe to, the efforts we take to develop media literacy. And I think most importantly, the accountability we take for the crimes that our government commits against humanity. After all, it's our taxpayer dollars that fund these wars and genocides. It's our votes that bestow power upon these warmongers and genociders. Although the media and government will always try to get us to, that doesn't mean we have to consent to what's happening. If you made it to the end of this video, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you. As I said before, starvation is a huge issue in Gaza, so I'm going to post the link to Palestine Children's Relief Fund